Hello and welcome to Adulting 101 Hand Sew a Mini Sewing Kit, Curbside Teen Crafts presentation from Plainfield Public Library. I'm Jennifer Heiss, and I will be the instructor slash crafting circle leader today. If you picked up your materials at the library already today, you will have a number of pieces of a number of things in your kit, which we'll go over in a minute. I want to take a minute to talk about what we're doing today and to share with you the resources that this class is based on. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. This class is based on, this craft is based on a craft that's available through the Creative Bug subscription at the library. If you sign up for Creative Bug, you can use your library card to get into it, and then either do a search on the kinds of craft classes you like, or for instance, search for this class by using the search engine and searching for Hand Sew a Sewing Kit. Sorry, Hand Sew a Mini Sewing Kit. Try Mini Sewing Kit. There it is. Sew a Felt Sewing Kit. And Creative Bug includes videos of all the steps, a pattern, information that you can download, as well as a transcript of all the steps. Now, the version that's on Creative Bug is done with a machine. We're not going to use a machine. We're going to hand sew it. So, one moment, please. Let's see. Let's admit our participant. Hello. Hello, I'm Jennifer Heiss, and I'll be presenting today. We're in Adulting 101, a Hand Sew a Mini Sewing Kit. I'm going to be giving the instructions. If you have a question, or if you have a video screen and you want to show me what you're doing, you can let me know in the chat, and I'll stop the recording because it is recording, so we don't capture your face in the recording by accident, and we can take a look at what you're doing as well. So we're working on this Hand Sewing a Mini Sewing Kit. This is what it looks like when it's finished, and let me just open it up. You can see that it's fastened with a tie, and it has a little pocket for various things. It has a pocket for your scissors, and it has a flap where you can put more needles or pins through it. So this is what it'll look like when let's try that again. So here's our scissors pocket. Here's our pocket for assorted other things. Because it's in 2 layers, we can put our pins through the inside layer, and we even have a little flap here that we can use to put our needles in. The kit that you received comes with the instructions, with the pieces of fabric. There's an outer piece, the larger piece, and an inner piece. A triangular shaped piece to hold the scissors, a square for the little pocket, and by the way, the little flap for the needles is optional. It comes in your kit with a needle and some pins attached to it, so you'll have pins for this. Your kit also comes with scissors because it's really hard to sew without scissors, a needle threader, one of these, and 3 of these little emergency mending thread with a needle in it in case you need to sew something up with a specific color of thread. So we wanted to be sure you were prepared. Because this is an Adulting 101 class, we are going to start by going over first some of the basic stitches. Oh, one moment. Hi. Hello. We are in Sew a Mini Sewing Kit. And what I'm doing, since we're recording this, if you want to ask a question out loud or you want to show me what you're doing and you have a question, please let me know in the chat, and then I can turn the recording off and we can look at it together and then turn the recording back on again. So as I said, your kit has these 5 pieces of felt, the back, the outside of your sewing kit, the inside of your sewing kit, the scissors pocket, the scissors pocket here, and the other pocket. And it also has an extra piece that you can, if you choose, sew on to the inside to make a flap. So what we're going to do is we're going to start by just going over some real quick information about basic sewing stitches. When you sew things together, generally you want, even if you're just mending, which is mostly the Adulting 101 part of sewing, right? Is you have to mend something or hem something. You want to pin it together so that the 2 pieces stay together. We've got our pins here. Some people like flathead pins. The pins in your kit, see if you can see this. The pins in your kit actually have a little round head, which I find very nice. You're just going to pin it together. Use as many pins as you need to hold the 2 pieces of fabric. Use as many pins as you need to hold the 2 pieces of fabric together. Try, and it's hard because the felt is thicker than regular fabric. Mine is especially thick. Yours is a little thinner. Okay, so try to make sure it stays as flat as possible. In your kit, there's 2 kinds of thread. One, and this is an error on my part, so I apologize. One is what's called embroidery cotton, 6-strand embroidery cotton, also known as DMC cotton. And this consists of 6 separate pieces, 6 separate threads that you can untwist and divide into 6 different threads or 3 sections of 2 or whatever you want. So if you divide out the 2, you can take your threads and sort of twist this backwards. Be careful, you want to twist it back as much so that it unravels and you don't get a big tangle at the end to separate that out. I would encourage you to use 2 strands of the embroidery floss anytime you're using the embroidery floss in this class, for this kit. There's also a thicker thing that calls itself cordage. You should each have a hank of this. And I'm going to demonstrate with the hank. This should work fine with the needle, the fat needle that came in your kit. It's not going to work so well with the kit, the needles that are in the emergency kit. We're just going to take a piece of this and I'm going to pull it out. If I pull it out correctly, it shouldn't kink. And I want a piece that is no longer than my arm, because once you get a lot longer than your arm, you get really tangled results. So I'm going to cut that off and I'm going to thread this through my needle. So I have my needle. The needle has an eye at the top end. That's the opening. And to make our lives easy, and also because I'm a little old lady, we're going to use our needle threader. We're going to take the metal piece at the end of the wire piece of the needle threader and push it through the needle's eye. Then we're going to thread our thread through the wire piece and pull gently. It might be a bit tricky to get it to come through at first because mine is being very recalcitrant. Pull it, there. Pull the needle off the threader and pull it until there's only one strand of the thread through your needle. And now you have a threaded needle. The other end, you need to have a knot, or else when you go to sew through the fabric, it's the thread's just going to come right out again. So what you're going to do, there's several ways to knot. The one I prefer is just to make a loop, crossing one end over the other, and then taking the loop the tail that's on top and putting it through the circle and pulling it towards you. That's going to make a small knot. It's hard to see. So make a couple other knots, couple more knots on top of that. The idea is to make the knot big enough that it's much bigger than the needle, so it won't pull through your fabric. So now we have a piece of thread with a needle on one end and a knot on the other. We're going to take our needle, we're going to come up through the underside of the fabric. Now, in many cases, if you're sewing the inside of something, there's not really an underside as such, because this is the outside. A lot of times when you're mending or you're sewing, you're going to have the right sides, the outsides together. In this project, we're actually going to put the insides together when we sew things. So just be aware of that. You're going to put the needle in up through the bottom. Now we can do a simple running stitch with this. If you're not already familiar with a simple running stitch, for those of you who are already familiar with all these stitches, you can just play with your scissors for a little bit. Okay, just don't run with them. We're going to take it to make a simple running stitch. We move the needle over, however wide we want our stitch to be. Okay, we push the needle back through the fabric all the way through and pull it out. And we have one stitch. Now we do the same from the underside, and that makes another stitch. The idea, whoops, mine got a little tangled on the back. So I'm gonna pull on that a little. And to make the tail stick out, okay? So the idea is to make the width between the places the needle comes in and goes out approximately the same for every stitch. If you've got a big enough needle and you're taking large enough stitches, sometimes you can actually take more than one stitch at a time. Okay, so to do that, it's a little hard to do. This fabric is kind of thick. You gather it onto your needle. Let me take the pins out. We don't need them as much now. You make one stitch on your needle, and then you just squish your fabric back on at the next spot where it would go back in, and do it again. The problem with that, with thick fabric like felt, is that's often hard to get it to line up correctly. But if you do that, you can get multiple stitches at one time. But as you can see, to do that, I had to make this stitch much longer. Another trick you can do is you can do what's called a back stitch. When you do a back stitch, when you put your needle back in, you go back one stitch width and put it in. And then when you bring it out, you bring it one stitch, you bring it out one stitch width forward from the stitch you just finished. So like so, pull it through, stitch again, right back where the other one went in. Now, the advantage of using a back stitch, like I'm doing now, is that because you're using more thread, you're doubling over the thread, you're going to find that you have a thicker and a stronger connection. But you may have problems like I have here. If you have a crooked stitch like that and it bothers you, you can back up, pull the whole thing out and rethread your needle. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to call this handcrafted charm instead. With my back stitches, again, coming out. The other thing about back stitches when you do this is the back side can look messy because you have multiple stitches. So that's a choice you make. If you're trying to mend something like a pair of jeans, you may want to use, or something that has a lot of stress on it, you may want to use a back stitch to make that stronger. The other thing you can do to make your sewing stronger is to use both that straight stitch or that back stitch, and then use a whip stitch to sew over the edges. A whip stitch is a really simple stitch where instead of going parallel to the length of the seam, you go perpendicular and you go over the edge. So if we're whip stitching two pieces of fabric at their edge, we're going to take our needle and we're going to go underneath, but we're going to try to come out at an angle. So here I went in parallel and I came out a little ways over. I got to be very careful that I don't tangle this. And now I have a little thing that goes over the top of that join. I can do that. I do that again. A lot of times when I do this, I will do it facing me, which makes it easier to see what I'm doing and to make sure that I'm coming out where I want to be coming out. Whoops, that was a mistake. All right. So the idea is once you just keep, I screwed that up. This is how you screw up a whip stitch. Okay. You can just go over and you want to go in and come out a little bit farther over. Try to get your line, your things lined up. Sorry, it's hard to see. And you're sewing the edges together. This is also the basis for what's called a hem stitch when you try to sew a hem, when you're trying to sew a hem to a piece on a piece of fabric. But instead of just sewing two edges together, let me show you what you're going to do. You would take, suppose this is the edge you're trying to hem. You're going to fold it under. Probably already been, if you're fixing something, it's probably already been folded under. Okay, and you line up the inside of that hem with a regular fabric. In fact, let me cut this off so you can see how it would look on a separate piece of felt. Hold on. Oh. Pardon me. Just take some of these off. You're going to fold your fabric up. You're going to fold the inside a little bit. Got to put you're going to pin it. Let me pin that so you can see what it looks like. It's hard to do this because this felt is very thick. There we go. but it does make it easy to demonstrate on because the felt is so thick. So you get to see a basic hem stitch. And then we can get started putting the project together, okay? Remember, every time you start a new seam, you want to make sure you have a nice thick knot with a hem like this. You're going to try to come up from inside the hem if you can, or from the back side of the hem, like so. And you can see this is dark, this is purple, but I'm sewing on brown and you can almost not see it. I'm starting from the inside of that fold and I take a little tiny stitch on the outside of the garment, little tiny stitch, big stitch through the fold, pull it through, move over, little tiny stitch through the back, big stitch through the garment, through the fold. Once again, okay? Just keep doing that and you have a hem. Let me just quick finish that and you'll see what I'm saying. Any questions? Okay. So I hope you'll be able to see the little purple threads holding up the edge of that hem. Do a couple more. A hem stitch is meant to be relatively quick because otherwise you would spend your whole day hem stitching things. So it's okay to make big stitches, but not so big you're going to catch your toe in them, like if it's a pair of pants. But you can use this to shorten a skirt, to shorten a pair of pants, to fix a pair of pants where the hem has come, or skirt where the hem has come down. See if you guys can see that. Okay, making a knot at the end of a seam. And cut this off again because you can make the knot you may need to make a knot at the end of the seam. You may also need to make a knot when you run out of thread. Because like I said, don't cut your thread longer than an arm length if you can help it. But that means you're going to run out of you're going to run out of thread when you're partway through. So you have a piece of fabric, you've got your two pieces of fabric, you've got this, maybe you're at the end. Let me just do a couple whip stitches so we can be at the end here. You're at the end of your seam. And how are you going to tie this off? Because obviously you have to keep a tight knot. Now with a hem, you don't want to make it too tight, but you have to make a tight knot so this will not come apart. Because the more stretch you have here, the more your seam is going to come apart. So how can we make this work? That's pretty easy. What we do is we take our needle, we start to make a stitch. So we have the needle stuck through the fabric and we still have a little tail end here that's still attached directly to the fabric. And we have our loose end that's attached to the eye. We have the loose end that's attached to the eye of the needle. Then we take the end that's still attached to the fabric and wrap it a couple of times around the sharp end of the needle. Okay, so we're just going to make a knot and we're going to wrap it around. We're not making the knot will be made automatically because then we're going to pull the needle through, tighten this up, pull it down, and it makes its own knot, just like we did when we did the loop and pull. Okay, so that's the simple part about getting started sewing together our piece of our project. Now, in terms of, anybody have any questions yet? Okay. Just put them in the chat if you do. Getting started, we're going to get out the pieces, and we want the inside piece, the slightly smaller one, okay? And we want the kind of triangular piece. We're going to lay that kind of triangular piece, make sure it's kind of cockeyed diagonally across, because the scissors we're using right now are about 4 inches long, and we don't quite have enough space to put it this way or this way. If you made this project again and you used a smaller pair of, if you were using a smaller pair of scissors, you could put it this way, make it shorter, but we're going to pin it diagonally across. Now, when you got the project, it should already be pinned with 1 pin, but that was kind of, you know, a haphazard pinning. So we're going to take our pins that came with the kit, and we're going to pin along the edges of that triangle. We're going to make sure we pin down by the end, the sharp end of the triangle. And we can, I would say, use 4 pins to pin. Oops, let me do one that doesn't have a green head so we can see what we're doing. We're going to also pin it up towards the top on the long side. So we don't really need to pin down the short side because we're not taking that short side is the opening of the pocket. We need to flatten this out as much as we can. You can check to make sure, take your scissors, slide them into the pocket. It should go pretty far, and make sure that they might not fit all the way, but they should fit at least part of the way into your pocket. Okay. With the pins there, they're not going to fit all the way, but they should look like they're going to fit. All right. You can also lay your scissors on top of the pocket and see how they're going to fit, because they should be inside, more or less inside the center box of the cross or the plus sign. If you choose to use your embroidery floss, go ahead and get your 2 strands of embroidery floss. Whoops, I always get that wrong. I always forget that you have to put the needle on the threader before you put the embroidery floss, before you put the thread through the threader. You can choose to do it the old-fashioned way where you lick it and point it through, but my eyes are too old for that. All right. 2 strands. We make a knot at the end. We're going to come up in one of the corners, and we're going to come up from the inside. Make sure this piece should have the letter B on one of the corners, on one of these edges, and that's going to be the back, because there's going to be things written on it. Oops, and I screwed up. See how I have some lines on this? So give me 1 minute. If you have pen lines on the front of your cross or letters, you want to take it apart and move it to the other side of the fabric, because you don't want those pen lines showing up on the finished piece. You want those to be on the inside of the finished piece. So let me just pin it again. And you can pin as many times as you want. You can unpin and repin, whatever it takes to make it comfortable for you. Okay. You can choose to pin with the ends going in the direction you're sewing, or away from the direction you're sewing. In any case, here we go. Let's get started. We go up from the inside and we sew through a corner of that triangle. And then we come back down again. So we have a stitch. One stitch, we do it again. I'm going to see how quickly I can do this. Now, the closer together you make your stitches, the stronger this is going to be, and the harder it's going to be for things to creep out of your pocket. Now, with the scissors, we're less worried about that on the sides because, you know, things aren't going to fall out of the scissors pocket on the sides. When we get down to the bottom of the triangle, though, we need to make an extra stitch there. Now, I will tell you that when I am sewing and talking at the same time, like this, I make terrible stitches. So don't worry, it'll still look cute. I promise. Or, you know, handsome, depending on whether you want to look cute or handsome. But it'll definitely look like you put that it's hand worked and you put all kinds of effort into it. I promise. Remember, see, I just got the tail end of my fabric stuck in my thread. That's another hazard of having thread that's too long. If I'm having trouble getting this to lay flat, I can once again take that pin out, flatten it out, and put the pin someplace else. This is short enough that I should be able to do multiple running stitches at a time, or I can do a back stitch. I might do a back stitch if you're familiar with it because, you know, the scissors are not that light. So here I'm doing a back stitch or a partial back stitch. And I just want to get all the way down to that point of the triangle. Once I'm down on the point of the triangle, I can take out my pins on that side, and I want to make sure that I use more than one stitch at that. See how the triangle is flattened at the end? We want to use a couple of stitches to hold that down. So I'm actually going to definitely back stitch that one. So I'm going to use a couple of stitches to make sure the end of the triangle is stitched down so the ends of my scissors don't stick out. Once I've done that, I can stick back out through the end of the sharp part of the triangle and stitch up the other side. Zoom, zoom, zoom. Okay. Now, and this is all in the instructions. You'll also see some really nice diagrams in the instructions of a whole bunch of different kinds of stitches that the International Alliances of Stage Employees Local 470 kindly allowed us to reproduce. It's off their website. So it shows what a running stitch looks like, what a basting stitch looks like, what a back stitch looks like. This is an overcast or a whip stitch. An overcast stitch was what I did before. And some other kinds of stitches like the buttonhole, the swing tack, and the vertical hem stitch, which was the one I showed you just before. Okay. Now, having sewn down both sides, and like I said, this is a little uneven. Having sewn down both sides of the triangle, you're going to take your pins out. Okay. Let me get that last couple of stitches done. You're going to tie, but first, of course, you're going to tie a knot at the end of your thread on the inside when you will get to the end of that seam. Okay. If you have trouble, you can always do a little tiny stitch. Like I ran out of space, so I'm going to do a little tiny stitch that's almost so small you can't see it. where I put the needle in almost right next to where it came out. Okay, so now I have the thread, the yellow thread on the back side. I'm going to do that same thing that I showed you before, where we go halfway through a stitch, wrap the thread around the end. Sorry, make sure you only do one strand of the thread. If you do both strands, it won't work. Wrap it around, pull the needle through, and let it tighten to make your knot. Always make sure that when you do that, you snip off your thread very close. You snip off your ends, sorry, very close to the fabric, but not so close that you interfere with the needle, with the knot, okay? That way you have less bumps on the inside. So now we have a little pocket for our scissors. We can stick our scissors in and see that they will in fact sit pretty much comfortably in there. Okay. You can take as long as you need to finish that part. The next step is to pin on your pocket. You'll have different color pockets. You can choose to pin them on wherever in any of the quadrants of the plus sign, wherever you want, but make sure that the opening of your pocket is on the same level, on the same side as the opening of your scissors pocket, because otherwise, every time you open this up, the stuff in your pocket is going to fall out, or your scissors are going to fall out. Okay, so here's my little pocket. I'm putting it on, looks like the right hand side, and I'm going to pin it down. I'm just going to try pinning it backwards. Okay, once again, making sure we pin it securely so it's not going to wiggle around when we're trying to sew it. We don't want the top edge to be too close to the edge of the cross, because we're going to sew this piece of this plus sign down to the other plus sign. When you pin, most people like to pin along the edge of the piece, the top piece, but you can also choose to pin it perpendicular to your edge, or you can actually pin it like at an angle, like that. Whatever you feel comfortable, whatever works the best for you. Okay, and then we go ahead and sew that down too. Once again, I'm going to use the green thread this time. Once again, we're just going to take a piece long enough that we feel comfortable to work with it, but short enough that we feel comfortable to work with it, and we pull it through. Okay, and I am using my needle threader once again. Well, one of the dangers of sewing is make sure that if you drop your needle or your pins on the floor, you pick them up, because there's nothing like finding out where your pins got to with the bottom of your foot. Little safety tip, right? Okay. How's everybody doing? You guys doing okay? Can I get a thumbs up, thumbs down in Zoom, maybe? All right. So, no thumbs. Okay. Once again, we're going to sew. And now normally, as you know, we would try to match the threads, but threads don't have to match. They can be contrasting. If you want to do really fancy sewing or fancy mending, you can do your sewing with a contrasting thread and nobody will criticize you at all. You just have to make sure that it contrasts in a way that it doesn't clash. That's my besetting sin So if you found that the colors in your packet clashed, that's my fault, I'm sorry. Okay, so once again, I'm just gonna do running stitch is the quickest. I could do an overcast stitch if I wanted to, and that would be kind of cute around the outside. So if you know how to do the Whipstitch overcast stitch, you could do that instead of doing a running stitch or a back stitch. But I'm just gonna sew it on down with a simple running stitch. Now, because we might put smaller things in this, maybe we want to try to make our seams, our space between our the length of our stitches a little smaller when we're sewing this pocket, because the width of the stitch is how much stuff can slide through. Okay, so we might open this up. See how the width of my stitches are wider than the wire bit on here. So I might open this up and find that my wire bit is sticking out. I'll have to suffer with that. Okay. Once again, just sewing along. I can take the pins out as I go when I don't need them anymore to hold it once I've sewn past them. And that's what we would do if we were doing machine sewing too. As we get to a pin, we take it out. Now with hand sewing, you can leave the pin in until you've gotten past it, because you're not worrying about running it over with the sewing machine. Okay, I'm just going to finish this up, and then we're going to do the last piece. This is optional on the inside. Now the last piece on that inside piece is going to be, if you choose to make a needlebook flap, you're going to sew that on. I would recommend sewing it on with a whip stitch or an overcast stitch. They're not the same, but I always forget which is which. As long as you know what you're doing, it shouldn't matter. I mean, as long as you know that you're sewing and you use the same sewing technique. As you can see, I'm having to pull this out a little. I may run out of thread before I get to the end of sewing this pocket on. So what do? If that happens, I'm gonna go to the back side, tie a knot, get another piece of thread, put it on the needle, and put a knot on the other side. Let's see, I've got 3/4 of the way around. Don't worry if you're not doing it this quickly. I just don't want you guys to get bored. Or sorry, you folks to get bored. I really appreciate you coming to watch, to see the class live. By the way, the class will be recorded and it'll be available on the library's YouTube channel, which is youtube.com/c/Plainfield Public Library. Looks like I'm gonna make it. With me, it's always a race. I don't know about still on the scissors. Okay. Yeah, the triangle is tricky the first time you do it. With me, it's always a race. I'm always like, I don't want to do an extra piece. I don't want to do an extra piece of thread. Can I make the thread last to the end? But remember, the smaller your little tail is here, the more likely your needle is to become unthreaded. And that wastes more time than making up a new thread. Okay, so here I am. I've gotten to the end. I'm doing the same thing at the end of my seam. I'm cutting it off, clipping it off tidily. This one I'm pulling through, and what did I do there? Making sure it's clipped nice and short so it doesn't stick out. And now I have 2 pockets. And if you wanted to be all fancy schmancy, you could take a button and sew it on, like on the inside, and then cut a little slit in the felt, because the nice thing about felt is it doesn't fray the way other kinds of fabric do. It is a non-woven textile, so it won't fray or rip the same way that regular woven fabric will. So you could put a button here and then cut a little slit to put the button through to button your pocket closed, but you don't have to. That's a fancy smancy trick. Okay, so right now what I have, you guys are still working on those triangles, and that's fine. What I have on mine is the triangle and the rectangular pocket. All right, I'm gonna find, oh, there's my other piece. And here's my piece that had my pins in it. And if I want to do the optional needle book, I can pin it on any of these sides. I can pin it here, I can pin it here, I can pin it here. I really wouldn't necessarily recommend pinning it here, because this is where your scissors are going to be and it might get in the way. Okay. But I can pin it to any side as long as I have extra around the edge so it doesn't get sewn down when we sew down this piece. I like to put mine down at the bottom, but you can choose to put yours at the side. You also have to decide, where are you going to sew it? Where is it going to flap from? It could flap up like this, or it could flap sideways like this. You're only going to sew that seam, the seam on the side where the flap, opposite the flapping. So if you wanted it to flap outward like this, you would sew the seam here. If you wanted it to flap upward, you would sew the seam here to make our little flappy thing. I think I'm going to put mine down here, which is what I did with the other one too. And I'm only going to pin it across the top, because that's where I'm going to have the needle book effect going on. Okay. So once again, I've pinned it as flat as I can. And now I'm going to get myself another piece of thread. Again, I can choose to use, I can choose to use the fat thread or the thin, or choose 2 or 3 things of the embroidery cotton. It doesn't matter. Remember that what you're working with, the needle that comes in the kit has an extraordinarily large eye. It's an embroidery needle, and it's meant to be used with large, with embroidery floss or something like this fat thread. Ordinary needles, you can buy needles in different packaging. They might come in an envelope like this. You can see this is old. It was $1 at Dollar General quite some time ago, or it might come in packages like this. This is Quilters and Crafters collection, so it has some funky ones, really long ones, curved ones. Or you might get it even at a dollar store in one of these. You can get a selection. You'll notice that these in particular have teeny tiny little eyes. Let me pull one out. I don't know if you can see it. So you have to be careful what thread you're working with those teeny tiny little eyes. If you want to use 2 strands of embroidery floss, to do all of your repairs, your mending, sewing things together, you can do that. My roommate, who is like the textile goddess of all time, does that all the time. She just uses big needles with big eyes. Yeah, because once you do the scissors pocket, so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to cut myself a piece. You got to be careful with these. If you pull it carefully, usually it won't pull out like this and tangle, but sooner or later it will do the tangly thing. I'm sorry, bad news. By the way, these are actually not sewing snips. You can buy sewing snips that are smaller. You can use any kind of scissors to cut your thread, but they should be relatively sharp. The problem is you need much sharper scissors to cut fabric, at least to do it comfortably. If you use, so if you have a pair of scissors that you get from, and I would recommend buying them from a craft store or a sewing store to cut fabric, don't ever use them to cut anything else. In fact, it's not a good idea to use those sewing scissors to cut thread even, because what happens is they get dull spots where you were cutting the thread that are, and other parts are still sharp. And that will cause you problems when you're cutting fabric. Don't cut paper with your scissors. Don't let anybody else cut paper with your scissors, with your fabric scissors. Pinking shears are a special case, but most of us don't need pinking shears for much of anything. Those are the ones with the zigzag blades. Okay, so once we get our flap pinned on, we're gonna sew. Again, we're gonna come up from the bottom into the corner of wherever we want our flap to be. Come up from the bottom into the corner. But we're gonna use that over the top stitch that I was talking about. Now, if you do a stitch like this and you catch it, that's called a blank, and on the edge of something, that's called a blanket stitch, but we're not going to do that. We're just going to sew under, come up a little ways over, go down one spot, come up a little ways over, go back in straight, come up a little ways over. And like I said, you got to be a little careful with the length of these stitches, but this kind of overcast stitch is really fast, which is helpful when you're trying to mend something. I can't tell you how many times when I was in middle school, for some reason, it was my jeans, and it was always the seams on the sides or the insides of my thighs. And I carried a sewing kit, and when it ripped, like to be uncomfortable. And I know everybody wears ripped jeans nowadays, but this was uncomfortable. When I would carry a sewing kit, I duck into the ladies' room, into the girls' room, and sew up that seam. You can also, if you have any kind of other wardrobe malfunction, if it's something is supposed to have a zipper or a slider or a hook, you can temporarily sew it shut. That'll get you through the day. And then cut yourself out of it. Did you know that before zippers, where people had, and when people had, a lot of people had servants to wait on them, sometimes even if they didn't have servants to wait on them, instead of they might pin themselves into their dress using straight pins like these, not safety pins. I think I prefer safety pins. Or they would sew themselves into their dress and then unsew it at night. You know, which is, I'm like, okay. But I know people who have done historical costuming and they say it's not hard at all. In fact, when you do sometimes when people do theatrical costuming, especially movie costuming, they'll sew somebody into their clothes just to get the right look. so it fits exactly the way they want it to. So as you can see, I'm just making those straight stitches perpendicular to the edge. Too long. Thread tail too long. With a whip stitch, you want to be careful that you don't pull it too tight, because you don't want to end up pulling it, like warping the fabric. Okay, so now I've got my whip stitch. I go back under to the back side. How we doing? Okay, you can see I made big stitches. I made big stitches here. And when you look at the underside, this is the thing about a whip stitch. You see, just like you see on your jeans, a little tiny bit of the thread, but you don't see a lot of it. So you can almost use any color when you do that, because you won't see the thread. Once again, doing my happy little knot on the end. This is why we have scissors, because you get in the habit of biting off your thread and then it never flattens out properly, and it's hard to put through the needle eye. I got to tell you, scissors make it really so much easier. Okay, so this is what it will look like when you've put all the little pieces and parts onto that inside piece. Any questions yet? Remember, because we're going to sew this to the outside part, every single part of this is essentially a needle book flap. We can just, once they're together, we can put a pin through the inside and it won't show on the outside. Okay. So aside from sewing down the inside to the outside, there's one last thing we want to do, and we need to do that before we sew the pieces together, or we'll make ourselves crazy. I mean, you can do it afterward, but it's annoying. So you should have had with your kit, you should get a piece of ribbon. Okay. This ribbon is the piece that we're going to use as the closure for this. Now you see, when I did mine, I did it with a contrasting thread, partly so people would be able to see what I did when I sewed it on there. You don't have to use a contrasting thread for everything except maybe the blue ribbon. I gave you a embroidery floss that was more or less complementary. Well, the blue ribbon, and I think somebody had brown. I tried to give you something that was complementary to your ribbon. If you decide to put this off and do it with a different thing, you could sew it down and just not sew all the way through, but that's going to be tricky because you don't want to sew your scissors pocket shut, because that's on the other side of this. Okay, so let me find the ribbon. Okay, I got a piece of white ribbon that I can use. Now, if you don't like this ribbon, you could get another piece. That's fine. You want it to be about 30 inches long. You can cut it longer than that and then just trim the ends. If you're concerned that the ribbon will fray, you can tie it at the ends, or you can even put like a little bead on it. That's what they did in the original project, but we kind of ran out of money and also patience for finding little tiny bits and pieces. So I'm going to tie my knots on the ends so that it doesn't fray. So I got my piece. And again, you can choose to use either contrasting thread or thread that that goes along with it. Where did there's my thread. One moment, please. You should have seen when I was putting this project together, I spent so much time looking for the needle threader. And you can see that I took pictures of how the needle threader works. I took pictures of how the needle threader works that are in the handout. And they were and I just kept, but they used a very light metal needle threader, and the needle threader just kept getting lost. Okay. So once again, cutting ourselves a piece of thread. Again, I would suggest using 2 or 3 strands of the embroidery floss to do this, but you can use the thicker thread if you want. So I'm just getting it set up. I'm just getting this set up while I'm talking. See, this is what happens when you don't try to twist it before you untwist it before you take it apart. You get a knot right in here. So it's easier to do it that way. Okay, so we have our thread, got my thread, I've got my needle. For a big-eyed needle like this, you don't usually need a needle threader, but once you get down to those tiny eyes, it's hard. And especially if you don't have a sharp scissors to cut the end, or if you're using multiple threads, threads from the embroidery, it's a lot easier to use that needle threader. Needle threaders come in all kinds of types and sizes. You can get fancy ones. These are really cheap. I think we paid like $3 for a package of 20. If you are seriously into sewing, not only are there regular sewing shops, there are embroidery shops. I know there's one in Edison. It's really nice. That will just, they usually have a lot of people who hang out there. They have sewing days. They have, and they have all the colors of thread in the world. I took up, when I was a teenager, I took up cross stitch sewing because I loved the colors. I loved the colors of the thread. Okay. So I've got my piece of thread. I've got my string. Are we ready to think about how we're going to attach this? What do you guys, what do you folks think? Do we want to talk about this, or do you need me to slow down and wait for you? Okay, I see a sure. Okay, so with the outside piece, first of all, check to see if you've got lines. I've got pen lines here. So I want those to be on the side away from my ribbon, because that's the side away from my ribbon is the side that I'm going to sew to the smaller piece. So make sure those are on the other side. And then fold your cross in half. Now here's where things get sticky, because I'm going to have to guesswork it. I don't seem to have a, wait, maybe I do have a pen. Nope, I don't have a pen here. I have a pencil. That'll do. Okay, so you're folding it in half to see about where you're going to want to put your ribbon. And you're going to draw a line along that fold that basically, you can do it with a pencil, you can do it, that basically goes from just across that center cross. Okay, my pencil is not very good, but I'm going to rough it up so you can see it, I think. Can you see the line I drew across the center? And you see it doesn't go in to the arms of the cross. Okay. Now it doesn't matter whether we set our finished piece up to tie side to side or top to bottom. It really doesn't, because the way these fold, it's going to keep anything from falling out as long as we fold them correctly. Okay. The trick is to remember, wherever you put your pocket, make sure your pocket is not the last thing you fold in. Okay. So you can do it across this way or up and down. Either way, we need that little line here. And then we're going to try to find about the middle of your piece of ribbon. The shiny ribbon has one side that's shinier than the other, but it really doesn't matter that much. You're going to lay down the middle of your ribbon so that the middle of the ribbon is about in the middle of your plus sign, and start there, pinning it down. Okay. It'll probably take about 3 pins, depending if you have if some of your pins are a little short, because we did work with some of those pins were donated. If some of your pins are a little short, it might take 4 pins, but you want to just pin it down flat so that the ribbon is attached, is pinned across the middle of the center square of the cross, not going out on the other sides, because that will limit how you can do it. Okay, how you can fold it shut. So I've got 3 pins in here running right across. Now you have to make a decision. Depending on what kind of thread you're using, you can choose to either do a straight running stitch, which is what I did here. I just did a running stitch, which you can see because I did it in contrasting thread, or you can try to sew down both sides with an over the edge with that whip stitch. I think that for this project, it really doesn't matter which you choose. If you prefer not to have the edges of your ribbon, now you can see I did a very poor job on this part. So it wasn't flat. So you can see that it's wrinkling up. If you keep it flat, it's not going to do this. You're not going to have the wibbly wobblies here that this one does. But if you want to make sure you don't get wibbly wobblies, you can sew 2 lines of stitching, either straight running stitch along the top and along the bottom, or a whip stitch or an overcast stitch along each edge. My thought about a ribbon like this is that it is the thing most likely to get messed up. So if you make it fairly easy to take it off and replace it, you may not regret that. Okay, you guys, are you folks clear on how this part works? Okay, so we take our, and in order to slow us down a little, I'm going to try doing that as a whip stitch. Again, we're going to come up from the bottom because we don't want our little pieces of thread sticking out from underneath our ribbon. So to slow me down, I'm going to do it along the edges. Whoops. And you see, this is my besetting sin. I have to rethread the needle. I also want to mention that the library has a large selection of ebooks. You wouldn't think this. You really wouldn't. We have a whole bunch of ebooks about mending that are in your handout and on Hoopla Digital. And some of them are pretty cool. We also have mending books, a couple of mending books in the physical library, and other libraries in the libraries of Middlesex Automation Consortium. The group of libraries we belong to have more books. So if you're interested, and apparently there's all kinds of tricky stuff that you can do with mending. Let me just show you. This is a book that I borrowed from another library in the consortium. See, these are like fancy patches, and if you look carefully, they look just like our pockets, but they look intentional. So if you need to put a patch on something, you can just make a patch and make it look intentional, or you can fold down the edges and kind of hem it on. But apparently there's a trick where you can do fancy embroidery like stuff. This is like this fancy embroidery. It's actually mending. It's a Japanese thing. I'm really curious about that. But here's an example. See, this patching thing looks just like what we were doing with putting on the pocket. So the thing is, if you are going to put a patch on, I'm going to give you two pieces of advice. One is fold under the edges and get somebody to iron them for you so that they're flat if you don't have an iron yourself. Or use a patch of something like felt that doesn't fray. And the other is when you put a patch on like that, if you're having trouble getting it to stay where you want it to, they have that iron, that heat fusible it's called heat fusible interfacing, and you can still get it at shops. So if you have this is your favorite jacket of all time, you can put this stuff in between the patch and the thing you're patching and iron over it, and it will make the patch stick. But I would still sew around it because that stuff peels off in the dryer. It doesn't peel off right away, but it does peel off in the dryer. Okay. So like I said, with sewing the ribbon down, it's harder to keep it straight than it is with sewing the patches down, because the ribbon's kind of fluffy, it's light. Okay. If you have trouble, take your pins out, stretch it again, pin it again. You can have too many pins. You can have just the number of pins that you need to make it work for you. That's the right number of pins. I know people who do this entirely without pinning. I know that I've done it myself. For some things, it works just fine. For other things, you regret it if you don't pin. My big thing is if you have a triangular tear under the arm of a shirt and you're trying to repair it, you had better pin it. In fact, your best bet is to put a patch if you can. Then you turn around, you go around and put a patch on under the other arm, and then it looks like a whole new shirt. Okay, I don't want us to take too much of your time, but I'm just going to sew this down, and then we're going to talk about how to sew the outside down and the things to be aware of. And then we're going to see if you guys have any, if you folks have any questions about finishing the project. Okay. So I'm going to get this both sides to give you a chance to catch up a little bit. I'm just going to take that pin out. Always when you pull a pin out, either put it in a pin cushion or in a booklet like this, or use a magnet. I really prefer to use a magnet to hold my pins, because then I don't have to fuss with it too much. Because there's, like I said, nothing like finding out where the pins were with the bottom of your foot, or worse yet, sitting on the floor and finding where the pin was. You know what? I'm going to stop recording for a minute. So if you guys want, I'm going to stop recording for a minute. And nope, cancel. I want to pause the recording. Sorry. So now I finished sewing down the ribbon across the back. I'm going to make another knot here. And with felt, the nice thing about felt is you don't have to go all the way through the fabric, because the felt's pretty thick. So you can go part way through the fabric if you want. And the last thing I'm going to do here is snip off the tail ends. So that it'll lay pretty flat. And then I'm going to take the inside piece and match it up. And I have to say, I had to measure and cut each of these individually. So it's entirely possible that you may want to rotate this around a little till you find the combination that the layout that fits the best. Okay. You just want it to be relatively, you want to have relatively even gaps on all the sides. Okay, so it looks like this is the way that fits the best for this piece. And then I'm going to pin it down. And I gave you 12 pins. You don't have to, I would suggest starting by pinning. I usually just pin triangularly in the corners just to get everything positioned. And then I pin the edges where I'm going to be sewing flat. You should have enough pins to go pretty much all the way around. I think I gave you 12 pins. But if you don't worry. Just kind of fudge it on the corner that you're not currently working at. And then when you take out your pins, as you're sewing along, you can more securely pin down the other corners. If you get it, if you get, let's see, what is it? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. If you get your pins in the outside corners, those 8 pins, then you can pin down. There's my other pin. You can pin down the piece you're actually working on specifically. You pin down the edge that you're working on at a specific time. Okay. If you have more pins in the house, you're welcome to use more pins. Okay. So I've got the corners. I'm actually going to put another pin on this side because I would want to start here. Okay. The only trick with sewing the outside part is you need to bring your needle up from between the pieces of fabric. Well, the other trick is not sewing shut your pockets or anything like that. Okay, you're going to bring your needle up from between the pieces of fabric as opposed to from the back side. That way you don't have to worry. Oh, come on, give me my thread. That way you don't have to worry that you're going to have a raw tail hanging out somewhere. And you're probably going to have to stop, tie a knot, start again. Like I said, let's see, where's my needle threader? There it is. So let me just demonstrate the part where we're starting from in between the two pieces, because it's really hard to describe. But once you see it, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. Now, I'm using a contrasting color because I just like doing the contrasting color thing. Some people do, some people don't. Make my knot, and then got my corner here. I'm going to come up, I'm going to take the needle, I'm going to put it between the two pieces of fabric, and I'm going to come up from underneath to the top, into the top piece of fabric, and pull it through. Now, when I'm done pulling it through, I have the tail, and so the tail is still sticking out. Can you see the tail? And we can tuck that tail into between those two sides so that it will not go flapping in the breeze. And then we start to sew. And here you can make big stitches if you want. It's more important, I think, for this. I think you'll feel more confident if you concentrate not so much on making small stitches. My big thing is I tend to make small stitches, but making it straight and even. If you have trouble sewing a straight seam, you can use a pencil or a piece of chalk. Tailor's chalk will do, but even regular chalk will dust right off, or a chalk marker to draw a faint line. Or even, because this is felt and you saw how it roughed up, you can even use a pin or the head of your needle to make a little line to help you keep track with when she was sewing it, because it's really important when you're sewing with the machine. Let's try that again. Thank you, Hannah. I don't know where I got stuck. I don't know when we stopped sewing. We stopped recording. All right, so right now we're sewing down the edge. So I don't know when it stopped recording. Thank you, Hannah. Sorry, thank you for telling me that it was recording. It stopped recording. It's probably when I was messing with the thread. So I'm just sewing a running stitch as even as I can all the way around the outside, not getting any of the extra bits caught in it, and going all the way around the outside. So we've got our pockets and our flap sewn on the inside. We've got our ribbon sewn on the outside. Once we finish this, we're going to make another little knit. We're going to try to make a little, when we get all the way around, we'll make another little knot. We'll tuck the knot underneath as best we can and cut it short and tuck it underneath. So, and then we'll be done. And then let's just quick reminder of how it folds up, okay? So I'm just gonna pull mine, I'm gonna pull my thread out. And the nice thing about this kind of thing is that you can just put your needle through here, put your thread to the center, and come back to it later. When you're done with it and you're ready to fold it up, make sure you fold your pocket side in. Oops, this is being weird. Okay. Make sure you fold your pocket side in, not the last piece. I've still got some pins in here and that's making it fold funny. But we fold the pocket side in. Maybe we fold the other side, fold the bottom up, we fold the top down, and then we can tie it shut. Of course, it's not going to tie shut very well with the pins in it. So let me show you again with this one. This one did pretty well with the ribbon across, but like I said, you can also do it up and down. Again, pocket goes inside, the other side, flip up the bottom, flip down the top, and tie the two ribbons to make a package. You can always, double tie it if you think you can get it untied, and then you can just stick it in your backpack or in your dresser drawer or in your suitcase, and you have your sewing kit for whenever you need it. Okay. I want to encourage everybody to use the resources we have at the library. I also wanted to let you guys know that we are that we are having a Chinese New Year craft on the 1st of February, where we're going to be teaching people, where I have an origami expert who's going to teach you how to make an origami tiger, because this is the year of the tiger, and she's going to talk a little bit about the Chinese New Year celebrations. There's also going to be some candy in the take-home bag for that one. Okay. Again, we're Plainfield Public Library, and this is Adulting 101, Hand Sew a Mini Sewing Kit. The class recording will be posted on YouTube. We probably have, if you know somebody who would be interested in this but did not get the kit, please have them call, email the library or come by the library. I think we have some spares, and they're not going to do us any good, so we're happy to give them away to anybody who can use that kit to make the sewing kit. All right. Thank you so much. And